Well, it's 7 o'clock on my computer here, and I'm excited to welcome you all. Good evening, and welcome to uh, Deanne. You don't have audio yet? Yes, I'm speaking to everybody. Does every raise your hand if you all don't have audio? Looks don't know. Everybody seems to be able to hear Deanne, so um, I'm going to get started here. Good evening and welcome to the 2025 Likes Lecture Series. My name is Kay Ifner. I'm with the New Philadelphia Board of Directors, and I see mostly familiar faces here, but anybody that's new, we certainly welcome you. This is our final presentation of the 2025 lecture season, and we saved the best for last with our own Claire Martin, and we're excited to have her here with us. Before we get started, as you heard, the program is being recorded, and all of our recordings will be posted on the New Philadelphia website and also this year on YouTube, so that'll be exciting. We like to build community with our lecture series, so we appreciate it if you leave your video on so we can see your faces as we go through. And you're welcome to put questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that as we go along, or any other comments for that matter in the chat. I have muted everybody because of background noise and out of respect for the speakers, so when we get to the point where we have questions, you'll have to unmute yourselves. Just a little bit of history about the Likes Lecture Series. The formal name is the Marvin J. and Thomas Leo Likes Lecture Series, and it's named for surveyors Marvin Likes and his son Tom of Barry, who donated so much time and energy to New Philadelphia. The series began in 2004 as part of the Archaeology Field School sponsored by the National Science Research Experience for Undergraduates program, and it was open to the public. 6 field sessions were conducted in 2004 to 2006, and then again in 2008 to 2011. And the lectures provided a great way for the students to inform the public and a great way for the New Philadelphia to inform the public and the students to share their research. Until 2020, our lectures were in person at Sprague's Kinderhook Lodge near Barry, and we thank the folks, Andy Sprague and his mother Pat, for hosting us all those years. Since 2020, we've been doing our lectures on Zoom, which has allowed us to have participants from all over the country, as well as speakers from all over the country. But the series have always been held on Tuesday evenings at 7 o'clock during the month of June since 2004, so that makes this our 21st year. Our theme this year is Roots of Resilience, Stories that Endure. And if you look at the 4 topics that we've offered this year, you'll see the connection with that theme. Tonight, our topic is Inheritance Among Her Brethren, New Philadelphia Women, Part 2. From our very own Claire Martin. And this is one of our most popular topics of all times, the women of New Philadelphia. So we're excited to end the 2024-25 season with that research and presentation from Claire. Claire Fuller Martin is a retired research associate from the Illinois State Museum and was the project historian for the New Philadelphia Archaeological Project. She holds an MA degree in history from Michigan State University. Claire Fuller Martin has been involved with New Philadelphia for over 20 years and has recently returned to our board of directors, so we're happy to have her back. She researched, wrote, and designed the wayside exhibits that are in the kiosk at New Philadelphia and continues to research and write about the families in the New Philadelphia community. So Claire, would you like to unmute yourself and take over?
Okay. It's my Okay. Okay. Well, this is kind of a rerun of a lecture I did 3 years ago, but I've got some new information to add. I'll give you some short sketches of several women who lived at New Philadelphia. I've reduced some of those sketches. I've left some out, and then the ones that I've kept, from before, I've shortened. So they're kind of down to the bare bones. So we can elaborate in the questions afterwards if you have any. Excuse me. I assume that most everybody here knows the basic story of New Philadelphia. And again, if not, we can answer questions afterwards. But always remember, New Philadelphia was always an integrated town from the very beginning. So some of the women we'll be talking about were Black or mulatto, and some were white. And it was a very small, unincorporated town. So when we speak about the New Philadelphia community, we're talking about the people in the town itself, but also the people in the farms around the town in Hadley Township. I began researching families at New Philadelphia 20 years ago as part of the archaeological project. At that time, we had Dr. Walker's book about Free Frank McWorter. So the late Natalie Armistead and Dr. Chris Fennell and I began trying to learn about what we could about the other families at New Philadelphia. But of course, at New Philadelphia, all roads tend to lead back to the McWhorters. So I like to start, hang on a minute, with Free Lucy McWorter. She's pictured here in the center. She was the first lady of New Philadelphia. And to her right is Lucy Ann Vaughn, her youngest daughter. And to the left, or to my right, to the left is Hailey Clark, who is her granddaughter. Free Lucy came to Pike County with her husband, Free Frank, and 4 of their children in the spring of 1831. When Frank met Lucy in probably the 1790s in Pulaski County, Kentucky, she was enslaved to the family called the Denham family, and he was enslaved to the McWhorter family. Lucy was almost surely born in slavery in Virginia, but we don't know whether she was always enslaved to the Denham family or whether they had purchased her from somebody else. As is frequently the case with women and African Americans, the documentation is sketchy. And of course, the farther back we go, it gets sketchier. They got together in about 1799. They could not marry legally because they were enslaved. So there's no marriage record to go back to. Although later, when they were in Pike County, they did marry legally after they'd been together for many years. But they committed to each other, and their first child, Judah, was born in 1800. They would have 7 children who survived to adulthood. And I understand from talking to family members that there were many more than that who did not survive. And as I'm sure most of you know, that was a very common experience for women, especially enslaved women in the 19th century. Frank purchased Lucy's freedom in 1817 and his own freedom 2 years later. Lucy was 45 years old at the time and was pregnant with her son, Squire. So when she was freed, Squire and her subsequent children were born free. And I've marked here the people in this family who were born in bondage. And as you can see, there were children, not only the children, but grandchildren, even great-grandchildren who were born in slavery. And because it took them many, many years to get everybody out. You had to get the money together, and then you had to negotiate with the owners because they might not necessarily want to sell them. So Free Frank died in 1854, but Lucy lived on in the community until her death at the age of 99 in 1870. Now, I've always been kind of intrigued by the family of Frank, or not Free Frank, but Frank McWorter Jr., who I understand the family called Young Frank. We know that in the 1820s, his enslaver was threatening to sell him, and so his father, Free Frank, told him to run to Canada. And while he was in Canada, then Free Frank negotiated for his freedom. This Gerald and Kate McWorter just found this ad just days ago, and it's actually the ad they found was in the Louisville paper. This one's from the Lexington paper, but they're exactly the same ad, and it's the ad that the owner ran, offering an award for the return of Frank. And you can see it gives a detailed description not only of Frank and what he looked like and what he was wearing, but also what the horse that he took looked like. So that was sort of an exciting find on the part of Gerald and Kate. Free Frank was able to buy young Frank's freedom, and he returned to Kentucky in time to help his family move to Illinois. That was in the winter of 1830, 1831. But he didn't settle in Pike County. We don't know how long he stayed or how often he came back, but he returned to Canada, and he and his brothers continued to help freedom seekers reach safety there in Canada. By the mid-1840s, young Frank was in middle age. He married a young English woman named Mary Ann Shaw. I have yet to find the marriage record for them, but I'm pretty sure there would be a legal marriage record, but it could be in Ontario, in Michigan, in Illinois, or even someplace else. And in looking for this, I realized that we don't actually know what name Frank would have used when he was a fugitive in Canada. So he could perhaps have continued to use whatever name that was. So anyway, there's still a lot of mystery, but in 1850, this is the only census record that I just love looking at, because in 1850, Free Frank and Free Lucy were living at New Philadelphia in that community, and every single one of their surviving children was living there and was free. Now, there were still grandchildren who were enslaved, and that work to get them out would continue even after Frank's death. But at this point, they had spent half a century just trying to get these people free. So young Frank is there, and if you look at the top one, I don't know how well anybody can see it, but the top portion is Frank and Lucy's household, and about halfway down is Francis, and he's age 45. He's a male, and he's living in Frank and Lucy's household. And then the second part down below is actually in the town of New Philadelphia, Squire McWorter and Mary Ann, Frank's wife, and his two little girls, Mary and Lucy, are staying with Squire and Louisa McWorter. And I don't know why they're in two different households, but there they are. So Mary Ann is 22 years old, so quite a few years younger than Frank. And her little girls are Mary, she's 3 years old. She was born in Canada. And then Lucy is only 5 months old, and she had been born in Illinois, and we assume at New Philadelphia. So young Frank died only 2 years after that census, and his daughters became the wards of his brother, Squire. When Squire died in 1855, then the guardianship passed to Solomon, who also had become the executor of Free Frank's estate, because Free Frank had died in the meantime, too. The little girls, Mary and Lucy, continued to receive their father's share of the Free Frank estate, at least into the 1870s, but for a long time, I didn't know where they were. I eventually found that around 1853 or 4, Mary Ann young Frank's wife, had taken the girls back to Canada and married an Anglo-Canadian farmer named Charles Rhodes. Marianne herself was apparently illiterate, and we can see that on this document, right? Kind of in the middle of, I keep wanting to point to my screen. In the middle of the document is what looks like a signature, Marianne McWorter, but between the Marianne and the McWorter is a little X, and the clerk has written the name and then her mark on either side of it. And so that's where she made her mark. The document was asking the court to make Squire the guardian for her daughters. This document was dated on September 8th of 1852. And then in October of 54, just 2 years later, she made her mark on a receipt for funds that were received from Free Frank's estate for her girls. And this time her name was Mary Ann Rhodes. So even though I haven't found a marriage record for them, I know that she had married Charles Rhodes sometime between September of 52 and October of 54. Now, some contact obviously must have continued between the McWhorters in Illinois and Marianne and her girls in Canada. And we know, of course, that Squire and Louisa McWorter were for a short time in Canada. And of course, that Squire and Solomon maybe were helping people get to Canada. So that would be a way they might keep in touch. The probate records indicate that there were payments made to the girls. These are kind of scanty. A lot of them are missing, which is not unusual. But they were getting payments from the estate when there was, like when the crops sold or whatever, and they had money. And then in the early 1870s, the girls are called by their married names in the probate documents. So down in Illinois, they knew they had gotten married. They knew who they had married. But on the other hand, from the Canadian side, not once on any birth, marriage, or death certificate I found do Mary and Lucy come anywhere close to getting the name McWhorter right. It's often the closest they get is McWaters, but sometimes it's Qualters. Sometimes they use their stepfather's name of Rhodes, and it may mean nothing because that happens a lot when you're giving a clerk a name and then they write it down. It's the way the clerk hears it, but it gives me the feeling that they, even as young adult women, didn't have a close connection to the family down in Pike County. But I may be reading too much into that. Anyway, their mother, Mary Ann Rhodes, and her second husband lived together the rest of his life. And they had some children together, but I haven't figured out which ones were his by his previous marriage and which ones they had together, because it turns out that the census schedules in Canada have even worse handwriting than the ones in the US. So it's very hard to figure out the name and the age that's scrawled on there. Mary Ann died in 1906 at the age of 85 and is buried with her second husband, Charles, in Essex County, Ontario. Now, Mary Ann and young Frank's eldest daughter, Mary, the one that was born in Canada in 1847, was married when she was about 19 years old to a man named John A. Johnson. And he was an African-American, was born in the US, but his family had come to Canada. And they had one daughter named Rachel. It's not clear whether John Johnson died or they separated, but Mary, in 1883, she married another man named John Scott. And really sadly, she died the following year of consumption, and she was only 37 years old. Mary's daughter, Rachel, who we see here, married 3 times, the first time in Canada to a man named William Albert Franklin, and then to James Williams in Chicago, and then also in Chicago to a Negro baseball leaguer named Timothy Samuel Struthers. And apparently she never actually lived with Struthers, which is sort of a mystery as why that was. She was the mother of 2 sons with her first husband, and she raised some other children. She lived in Chicago for many years and died there in 1940. I've been speaking just in the last week to the descendants of one of the children who Rachel raised, that wasn't hers, but she raised them. Um, and they allowed me to use this photo of her. And we're working together to try to piece out more of the story. There's a lot of it that none of us understand. But Mary, her daughter Rachel here, and all of their husbands were always identified as Black. And here's just, I don't have any pictures of Lucy, so here's a little family tree. But the younger daughter, Lucy, married a man named James Vokes, Voakes, when she was 17. Vokes was born in England and was a member of an extended family of brickmakers who ranged around Michigan, Illinois, and Ontario. James and Lucy had many children, and at least seven of them survived to adulthood. Lucy and her children are always identified as white. James worked most of his life as a laborer. It's not clear to me whether he was really plugged into the family brickmaking business or maybe worked for them. I'm not sure. But they shifted around eastern Michigan, around the Detroit area and the Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti area. And then sometimes they would go back to Ontario. And at least once they went to Whiteside County, Illinois, where he had some relatives living. They both happened to die in Ontario, James in 1903, and Lucy lived until 1928. So the next two women I want to talk about, like Free Lucy, are important to the early years of New Philadelphia. And I spoke about them when I did this 3 years ago, but I've abbreviated them greatly. And we'll just kind of mention them tonight. But the first one is Clarissa Shipman. She and her husband Reuben were among the very first settlers in Hadley Township after the McWorter family. The McWorters were the first family in Hadley Township in the spring of 1831. But the Shipmans arrived from Connecticut shortly after that. They started their farm just north of the McWorter farm, and Reuben helped to survey the town of New Philadelphia. Clarissa was one of the few women we'll talk about tonight who could read and write, and some of her letters to family have survived. She wrote about the founding of New Philadelphia. She wrote about how Free Frank hoped to sell the lots to make money to buy his two oldest daughters out of slavery. And she wrote about the tensions in the community during the Civil War. She also talked about a time where some freedom seekers had been captured and sold back into slavery in the community. Her letters back to Connecticut, which are mostly the earlier ones in the 1830s, so when they really had not been here very long. She wrote back to her sisters, but she didn't actually write very much about her own day-to-day activities. But in 1836, she mentioned that she had to write considerable many letters for my neighbors. And this was something she just felt she had to do to help out the people in her community, because she was clearly the best educated woman and maybe as well educated as any man too in the community. She lived in the New Philadelphia community until her death of fever in the fall of 1869. She was about 78. Kezia Clark had a very different history. She was born in Spencer County, Kentucky in about 1800. Like Free Lucy, we assume she was born into slavery. In 1824, she gave birth to a daughter named Louisa, and a year later, their owner, John Bixler, emancipated them both. After a few years, John Bixler left his wife and moved with Kezia and Louisa to Indiana. Kezia would give birth to several more children, all of whom used the surname Clark, and all of whom are presumed to be children of John Bixler. So I should probably take that John Clark question mark off this tree, because I think we've established he never existed. But you can see again, Keziah and Louisa are the only ones in this family who were actually born in bondage. But they moved from Indiana, they moved to Greene County, Illinois, and they were living in Greene County, Illinois in 1830. That is the same time that the McWorter family were holed up for the winter on their way to Pike County. They left Kentucky in 1830 in the fall or winter. They stayed over the winter in Greene County, and then they came to Pike County in the spring. So this could be the first time that these two families became acquainted, because they came from different parts of Kentucky. But in 1840, the Bixlers and Clarks were living in Montgomery County, Missouri, where they had a farm. And I have no idea why a family that was mostly comprised of free African Americans would move to a slave state like Missouri. And we don't know exactly how long they were there. The earliest evidence that we have of Keziah and her family being at New Philadelphia is in 1843, because that is when her daughter Louisa married Free Lucy's son, Squire McWorter. Just to go back to Keziah for a minute. In the 1840s, married women could not hold property in their own right. Everything belonged to their husbands. And because Keziah and John Bixler were not married, Keziah was free to acquire some real estate. In 1845, she purchased an 80-acre farm just east of New Philadelphia. And that same year, John Bixler bought a lot in New Philadelphia. After John's death, Keziah paid the taxes on that lot and sold the lot. But there had never been any probate or deed transferring ownership to her. And I think the fact that she could sell the lot suggests to me that the community recognized her as John Bixler's heir. Whether there was a will or she was married or not, they saw her as his heir. So after selling his lot, she bought her own lot in New Philadelphia in 1854, and she retained ownership of the farm and her lot for the rest of her life. She probably didn't live on that lot for very many years, because by 1860, she lived with her widowed daughter, Louisa McWorter. And we'll hear a little bit more about Louisa later. Keziah outlived Louisa by a decade, passing away at the age of 93 at New Philadelphia. And right now, Kay wanted me to note something about the title of this presentation. When I first began studying New Philadelphia families, every time I saw Keziah's name, it was spelled differently. Spelled with a K, with a C, with an A, with an E, just goes on and on. One branch of my own family, we have several Keziahs, and I counted out 48 ways that you can spell it. So I decided that I really needed to come up with a standard way of spelling it when I write it or put it on a family tree. Obviously, if it's spelled differently in an old document, it has to stay that in a way in a quote. But since Keziah herself was illiterate, I figured she didn't have any opinion about how it should be spelled. And so I decided that it was probably a biblical name. And so I looked it up in the King James Version of the Bible, because I figured that would be the version that Protestants were using at the time that Keziah and my relatives were living. So it turns out that Keziah, spelled without an H on the end, was one of the three daughters of Job, who were born after all his many trials. And he declared that, contrary to the custom of the day and the time and the place, they would be able to inherit and own property just like their brothers. And that's where the line that they would have inheritance among their brethren comes from. And I thought this was really appropriate for our Keziah and also for many of the other women at New Philadelphia. So Sophia Troy was born in Ohio at the same year, in 1845, the same year that Keziah and John Bixler were buying their property around New Philadelphia. A disaster hit the Cartwright family. They were natives of Ohio, And Sophia was the mother of 4 sons. They ranged in age from 5 to 18 at that time. In the spring of 1845, Sophia gave birth to another child, but that baby died. And then Sophia lingered throughout the summer and died in August. By this time, it was malaria season, and malaria was endemic in Illinois at that time. Her husband, John, died in September. So John's probate files gives us many hints about what women's lives were like in Hadley Township in the 1840s. These little slips of paper, these are like this. And the old probate files are just full of them. Most people ignore them and look at the estate inventory and the will, but these are just a gold mine. The ones you're looking at right now two of them are the doctor's bills, and by deciphering what medicines he was selling them, and so on, you can sometimes figure out what they died of. And so among those little slips of paper were these. From the estate inventory, we know that Sophia was the owner of 3 spinning wheels, a clock reel, various loom parts, and a flax brake. When she died, there was no one left to beat flax, to spin flax and wool, to weave and dye cloth, or to sew clothes for the children, for the family. John Curtwright's estate paid these 2 women, Elizabeth Jasper and Sarah Johnson, to do this for them. And normally, when you look at the census or other records, when there's a place for occupation, for married women, it'll say something like keeping house, or it'll just leave it blank. They don't have an occupation. And because of this, we can completely miss the importance of their work in the family economy, because, well, as some of you probably know, well into the 20th century, the surplus butter and egg money, which was often produced by the women, was sometimes the only cash that farm families had between their crops coming in. So for months and months and months, sometimes that was the only money they had, the hard money in cash. So for a couple of years after Sophia and John's death, Elizabeth Jasper and Sarah Johnson spun, wove, and sewed clothes for the Curtwright sons, and they were paid for it. Without that probate record, we would not have ever known that these 2 women were 2 of the working weavers in the community, because that would have never been written down on the census record. This isn't Cordelia Racy, it's her daughter, but that's as close as I could get for a photograph. She was one of 2 Civil War widows who lived at New Philadelphia after the Civil War. Her father was a Canadian, and the family lived in New York State and Michigan before they came to Pike County. She married Henry Racy in 1852, and the wedding took place in New Philadelphia with Reverend C.S. Luce presiding over the wedding. They had 3 children. They moved around several times. And then finally, in August of 1864, Henry enlisted in the 39th Missouri Infantry. Now, he enlisted in August of 64. He died in hospital in Jefferson City in December of 64. Probably never got out of Missouri. As probably most of you know, more people died of disease in war than they did of injury, and he died of chronic diarrhea and typhus. Cordelia moved back to New Philadelphia in the early 1870s and bought 2 lots in Block 8. These were the same 2 lots that Reverend C.S. Luce and his family had lived on and run the post office and run a school around around 1850. She probably had bought the very house in which she had been married. She lived there until her death in 1881. She first attracted my attention through some documents we found, and in this time it was the deeds to her lots. It turned out that those lots had changed hands 4 times over the last 14 years, but not all the transactions had been written down and filed at the courthouse. When Cordelia purchased her lots, she insisted that the title to her property be clear. And so on October 30th of 1874, several deeds for these lots were filed at the courthouse all at once. And apparently nobody could remember exactly when they bought their lots from each other. So in one case, it looks like one person sold her lots before she even bought them. And this gave us some insight into the lot ownership at New Philadelphia. And it reminds us that deeds and tax records don't always tell us who really owned or lived on a lot at any given time. And it taught me to look at the date that the deed was filed as well as the date that it says that the transaction took place, because it could be 14 years later. So, so we talked about Kezia, and this is her daughter, Louisa. We know quite a lot about her, but there's just a couple of things I wanted to say. She married Free Frank and Free Lucy's son, Squire, in 1843, and they set up housekeeping on Block 6 in New Philadelphia. She gave, well, that we know of, she gave birth to 2 girls and 2 boys. There may have been more. 3 of them survived to adulthood. And around 1848, maybe 5 years after they married, Louisa and Squire built a house on Block 13. This was probably a 2-story house and possibly the only one ever in New Philadelphia, except for the current Burdick house, which was built 100 years later. This house was always assessed for taxes at a much higher rate than any other house in town. So we think it was the most imposing. It's interpreted in our augmented reality app out at the site. So you can learn more about that there. Squire died in December of 1855, and sometime in the next couple of years, Louisa's house burned down. After losing her husband and her house, Louisa and her children and her mother, Kezia, moved to Quincy for several years. Some of her brothers were already living there. They worked for the Comstock Iron Works and were active in the Underground Railroad. At the end of the Civil War, Louisa, Kezia, and the children returned to New Philadelphia, and they rebuilt the house. And once again, it was the biggest house in town. When we first began looking at the 1870 census for New Philadelphia, we found another one of those intriguing morsels. And I can't tell you how much I wish Natalie Armistead was still here to know this, because this is something we talked about a lot. Her household, Louisa's household, included Willie Jones, age 6. And the census would ask how each person was related to the head of the household. So it could be wife, son, daughter, mother-in-law, niece, whatever. But after Willie's name, it said abandoned child. Over the years, I've gradually filled in the story of how Willie Jones came to live with Lucy McWorter. And to make a really long, complicated story short, his name was Charles William Jones. He was the child of an African American man and a white German woman. The Clarks and the McWhorters knew this couple when they lived in Quincy, and that's where Willie was born. In the last days of the Civil War, Willie's father joined the U.S. colored troops along with Louisa's son, Squire Jr., and 2 of her brothers. Now, those men survived their service, but Willie's father did not. And the mother was refused the widows and orphans pension from the government because she could not document her marriage to the father. At last, she remarried to a white man and requested that the court appoint Louisa as her son's guardian. Willie stayed with Louisa until she died in 1883. He was not quite reached his majority at that time. I've traced Willie as far as about 1937. He lived long enough to get a Social Security number, but I have not yet really figured out the story of the last years of his life. I'll keep working on it. But I like to think that in childhood, he found refuge in New Philadelphia with Louisa and Kezia. Another Louisa was Eleanor Louisa Johnson Stewart. She was born in Missouri and was part of the African American community down in Alton, Illinois. In 1869, she purchased 3 lots in Block 12 at New Philadelphia. She was the first married woman in New Philadelphia to buy property in her own right. The Illinois law had changed in 1861, and it allowed married women not only to own property, but to keep their earnings. So those weavers back in 1845, in fact, one of the receipts in the probate for the Curtright family actually says they paid the money actually to the husband of the weaver. And now whether he gave her earnings or kept them himself is another thing. But legally, the money that those women made legally belonged to their husbands until 1861. So Louisa and her husband, Reverend George Stewart, and their daughter Lena lived in New Philadelphia for about 8 years. And then she sold her lots to Lucy McWorter in 1877. The Stewart marriage didn't last, and Louisa would go on to marry twice more after that. We know really almost nothing about her years in New Philadelphia, but she holds a place in the town's history for owning her own property and being married at the same time. And just a quick look at, in 1872, this is taken from the 1872 Land Atlas. So I filled in red the land around New Philadelphia that was owned by women at that time. The green square is the town of New Philadelphia. The purple square is the original McWorter family farm. And then the red places, squares and rectangles, are property that I know were owned by women at that time. The pink, I didn't know for sure. That belonged to Lucy Ann McWorter Vaughn and her husband Ansel Vaughn, and I wasn't sure whether this was part of Lucy Ann's inheritance from Free Frank, or whether she and Ansel had bought this property, or maybe kind of both. So I didn't know exactly. So I made them pink. So then also from the 72 Atlas, the town of New Philadelphia, the lots owned by women. Now, on that column of blocks on the right side, the east side of town, that are numbered 1, 10, 11, 20, nobody ever lived there, except for a few years in the 1840s. Somebody lived in a little cabin on a lot on block 11. And then the ones across the bottom where it says 17, 18, 19, 20, nobody ever lived there until the Burdicks built their house in block 19. So if you figure in 1872, those 2 columns, that row in that column, were never really inhabited. And that shows that if you look now at the red spaces, that's even a higher percentage of the town than you would think just by looking at this map. So now we have 2 families who are connected. They have one historic connection to each other, and you'll have to sort of bear with me on this one. First, we have the Kimbrough family. Many ways of spelling Kimbrough, as you can see. The Kimbrough family began life enslaved to Moses Kimbrough of Randolph County, Missouri. Martin Van Buren Kimbrough, who we see here, and George Washington Kimbrough, the 2 in the center, were twins. They were sold twice before they found themselves in Natchez, Mississippi, where they joined the U.S. colored troops, the heavy artillery. And after the Civil War, they returned to Missouri and found their sister Cynthia. The 3 of them, with Cynthia's 4 children, there are 5 listed here, but the first 4, came to Pike County about 1869, I think. And eventually the brothers settled in the town of New Philadelphia. And just a moment to talk about this picture. This is Martin Kimbrough. We were very surprised to find this picture in his pension file. I've never seen that before. But the image was not very good because it was the digital image was made from the microfilm and so on, and it wasn't very good. And so Charlotte King, just a few weeks ago, went down to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. with her phone and got some good images of this picture. So we're really thrilled because it's the only picture we have of anybody in this family. When she came to Illinois, Cynthia and her children used the name of Gilbreth or Gilbert. I see it spelled both ways. We don't know if that was the name of her last owner or the father of the children or both. But as adults, the three sons, Clark, Robert, and Charles, would use the surname of Green. Before emancipation, there were enslavers with all of those names in Randolph County. So I expect we'll never really know why they used one name and then the other, and what the significance was. While she lived in Pike County, Cynthia married a man named John Miller. And so her youngest child down there at the bottom of the list is Lily Miller, and that was their daughter together. So remember Lily, we're coming back to her. After Mr. Miller died, Cynthia moved to Springfield, where by that time all three of her sons were living. The other brother on this list is Reuben Turner. He never lived in Illinois, and so we don't have to worry about him. Now, second, we have the Payne family. They came to New Philadelphia more than about 25 years after the Kimbroughs came. Samuel Payne and his wife, Mary Logan, were born in the mid-1850s, so we assume that they too were born into slavery. They came from Lincoln County, Missouri to Pike County, Illinois. And we know they came here in either the last half of 1889 or the first half of 1890. And we know that because of when and where their children were born. In 1896, Mary Logan Payne died, and her obituary in the Berry paper indicated that she was the mother of 12 children, of whom 10 survived her, and these are the 10. It's possible that she died as a result of childbirth because her last child, Nellie, was born the same year that she died. At the turn of the century, Samuel was paying taxes on a 10-acre farm, 5 improved and 5 unimproved acres. And we don't know if he owned the land or if he was just renting, because sometimes the renters paid the tax, or whether he rented some other farmland to supplement this, because 5 acres doesn't seem like much to support a family of 10 children. And it really does appear that the family never did have very much income. By 1910, Samuel had remarried, and with the children who were still at home, he left New Philadelphia for Topeka, Kansas. The 2 children who concern us tonight are Lawrence, who is the third from the left, the third oldest, and Ida Bell, who's the 4th from the right. She's the 4th from the youngest. In 1907, Lawrence would marry Cynthia Kimbrough's youngest daughter, Lily Miller, and they set up household in Springfield. In July of 1908, Lily's brother, Clark Green, died. And shortly after that, Lily gave birth to a baby boy. She named him Samuel Clark Payne. Samuel, obviously, after Lawrence's father, and Clark after her brother who had just died. But when little Samuel Clark Payne was about 3 weeks old, a riot broke out in Springfield. A white mob roamed the city, attacking Black homes and businesses and murdering several Black citizens. And all 17 people lost their lives. The predominantly Black part of town was burned and people fled in all directions. Lawrence and Lily took their newborn and started for Pittsfield because that's where her sister Laura was living. We believe that they took the train all or part of the way, at least part of the way, probably. But by this time it was mid-August, and it was like it is now. It was deathly hot. By the time they reached Pittsfield, the baby died of exhaustion. He's buried in Pittsfield in an unmarked grave. Lawrence and Lily remained married for a few years, but they had no more children after that. The Forum, which was a newspaper by and for Blacks in Springfield, reported that she was ill for much of 1911 and 1912, but the papers would say people were sick, but they wouldn't really say what they had, so I don't know what that was about. But eventually, Lily and Lawrence separated. Lawrence remarried, took a job with the railroad, and went to St. Louis. Lily was still in Springfield as late as 1923, and I lost track of her after that. I'm still working on that. I have two, and this is actually a picture of the little baby's death certificate and the aftermath of the riot. I have two postscripts about the events in the summer of 1908. One is that the nation was so shocked that such a thing could happen in the hometown of the great emancipator that it ultimately led to the formation of the NAACP, and the site of where the African Americans lived and were burned out of their homes, that has recently been made a National Historic Monument, and it's being administered by the Park Service along with New Philadelphia. Second, as we were looking for reports of the Payne's flight from Springfield in the summer of 1908, Mary Nell Corton came across a notice that Lawrence's sister Ida Bell Payne was suing Thomas McWorter for bastardy. Thomas McWorter was a grandson of Louisa and Squire McWorter. Bell had given birth to a daughter named Helen in the spring, and the case was ultimately settled out of court, with Bell receiving $100 with which to support Helen through her childhood. Helen and Bell moved with Samuel to Topeka in 1910. Now, Bell and Thomas were still in their teens when Helen was born. Each of them would eventually marry later on, but neither one of them had any more children other than Helen. Except for this little foray into the early 1900s, I generally stop my investigations about 1880 or 1890, but there's still many more years of New Philadelphia and the women there yet to be studied. And here is a list of some of the women who have researched and preserved New Philadelphia history over the last 60 years. The photo is of Anna Agby Davies, who was one of the archaeologists who led the work at New Philadelphia. And oops, I went the wrong way. Just one more word about the archaeological project. The overwhelming number of the students in the field school were women. Several of them went on to complete their PhDs, and many found interesting careers in other professions. And we're very proud of all of them. And this is a list of the people who provided me with photographs of their ancestors, for which I am extremely grateful. But that's that.
Well, thank you, Claire. We did have a question in the chat for you from
Okay.
Jessica Brown, and she says that they have DNA results to connect her family with the Bixlers now. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, and feel free to jump in here, Jessica. And she wanted to know who Bixler purchased Keziah from and where the Clark name came from.
Well, that I don't know. And there was a family of slave owners in Spencer County that were named Clark. There was like an extended family. There were a lot of them. And so I've always wondered if she started out owned by them and then Bixler bought her. And maybe even did Bixler buy her in order to free her, which would be people did that sometimes. So I don't know, but I've asked that same question. I've been intrigued by it, but definitely there were people in Spencer County who were slaveholders who were named Clark. And I think there's got to be some kind of a connection there. I don't know if there's any kind of record of how Bixler acquired her in the first place. So yeah, it's a good question. I've asked it myself.
We also have a question from Gerald. Why do you have a slave name for Lucy? Did I?
I don't.
I'm not sure I understand the question either. Gerald, you want to unmute yourself or Kate and ask?
Yes, the question is, you used the name Denham.
Oh,
That's
well,
a
at
slave
one,
name, and
oh,
she
I
never
am
used that name.
okay. Free Frank did use that name. In the, I think it was the first, I understand your problem with it. But in the first census after he was freed, I think the first census, it's been a long time since I've looked at this. I think it was the 1820 census. I think he used Free Frank, and the 1830 he used Frank Denham, or maybe it was the other way around. But he did at one point use that name.
Claire, it was 1830 that he used Frank Denham.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know if I had it backwards or not. But yeah, and I understand your objection to it, and I can avoid doing that in the future. But yeah, it was.
Okay.
They did briefly use it, and it was kind of funny to see him using it since he wasn't even enslaved to that family. But I think it was because she was, and his children were.
Does anybody else have any questions? Those are the only two from the chat that I don't think have been answered. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Hey, Claire, it's Tara. Nikki
Oh, hi, Tara.
Hi, how are you? Good to see you. Correct me if I'm wrong. McWorter was the name of Free Frank's enslaver. Is that correct?
Yeah. And
And
it's always been thought that he was his biological father too, but
and Free Frank used the name
he
McWorter?
chose to use it. He spelled it differently when he had his name legally changed to McWhorter. And it's spelled without the H, but I think that's kind of a moot point. But
Okay.
yeah, he chose to keep that name. And you just don't know what the relationship is. The personal relationship. I mean, not the biological. Well, you don't know what the biological one is either.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So
I have another question. Claire, you said that Frank advised Frank Jr. to run.
Well, that was the story.
Where does that
I
information come from?
that's the story I've sort of always heard. I assume it was Dr. Walker's book, but maybe it's just the way it was sort of told verbally. I can check that out. That was how I understood the story, but I'll check and see if it was in Dr. Walker's book.
one of the people that have joined us today is Quinn Gilly, who is our park ranger for New Philadelphia. So welcome, Quinn. And he does have a question in the chat. If someone is interested in learning more about the women of New Philadelphia, are there any resources or publications that you would recommend?
Well, not specifically on the women of New Philadelphia, but certainly all the publications so far about New Philadelphia have touched on the women.
You can go through the Facebook page and look at the different things that we have written about over the years. And we really need to publish. Claire
we do.
needs to publish.
I really need to publish. I spent too many years passing out information to other people, and I need to get what I've got out there before. In fact, I'd like to get more of it on the website before I drop dead of old age and don't get it done.
Not going to happen. And Becky echoes the fact that you need to write a book in the chat. Just that we mentioned the Springfield 1908 race riots. Last year we did a session on that particular topic and its connection to the NAACP. So if you're interested, you could go back to the website and take a look at that recorded lights lecture. And also to put in a plug for Quinn, on July 15th, he is doing a program for the St. Louis County Library, an online program specifically on that topic. It's a free program in the evening on July 15th. You have to register for it, and we can send everybody the link to do that registration. So we're looking forward to that. Anybody else have anything they'd like to ask, or anybody? Oh, Tara, more? Yeah.
More, yeah. I could go on and on actually with Claire.
Okay.
Claire, you talked about some of the records you used to do your research. Probate sounds like probate records were a big source of
Big
material
thing.
for you. And deeds to lots. Would you mind just in general talking about some of the other ways that you went about the research
Yeah.
and particular types of documents that you found to be really fruitful? And thanks.
Yeah, I started with the census. At the time we started 20 years ago, the indexing wasn't very good online. And so we actually had the field school students transcribe a lot of those directly from the images of the census schedules. I sometimes use the agriculture census, and I actually feel like I should use it more than I do. It's available for 1850, 60, 70, and 80. And when you're talking about a rural farming community like this, it can be really interesting to see how much land any given family is farming and what the crops are they're growing and so on. Then I started going through the deeds. I went through all the deeds for and Charlotte King started on this actually for her senior thesis. But we went through deeds for the town of New Philadelphia up until you get into the 20th century, and the indexing, the way they index it at the courthouse changes, and it becomes just nearly impossible to trace. I guess that's what the title companies are for. But through the 19th century, it's quite easy to follow those deeds. And sometimes you find something in the deed books that is something else other than a straight transaction too. That may be where Free Frank's and Free Lucy's freedom papers may be. We've never found those, but you were supposed to, in those days, if you were a free African American, you were supposed to submit those to the courthouse. And so that should have been transcribed, and it's probably just buried somewhere in one of those books. So that gave us a lot of insight. And then tax records, we got a lot from. And nowadays, there's so much on the genealogical sites. Now, I don't find family trees very much help because most of them are so horrifically bad now. Mm-hmm. But people don't click on the little green leaf. Don't let it add anything automatically to your tree, or it will be a disaster. So, but I've now begun to get in touch with some descendants through those. And actually, in terms of the Race Riot and the Payne family, Tim Good, when he was superintendent at the home, asked me to try to trace descendants. And this is where I found out that one person after another had no children, or they'd have one child and that one didn't have any children. So I'm still kind of working on that, even though he's gone from the Lincoln home now. But I hadn't really been interested in tracing descendants before, but now I've gotten more interested in that. And also when you find some descendants, sometimes they have pictures, photographs, and or even documents and so on. So I've gotten more into using Ancestry.com in that way and as well as to get the documents themselves. But basically, I either want to see the document in real life or I want to see a good image of it. I don't want somebody else's transcription of it, or especially an AI transcription of it.
So that leads to a question that Lonnie asked. Can you share the names of some of the descendants you recently spoke with?
I guess so. I recently spoke with a descendant of Belle Payne and her daughter Helen. And that's where I got those photographs. His name is Damaris Patton. Actually, I can share this with Lonnie and Jess by email too.
Okay.
So he's a busy guy, and but I think we'll be able to talk some more. He's quite interested, and I'm hoping to get, and then these people that are kind of related to young Frank's daughter, but not really. They're related to somebody she helped raise. Their name is Struthers, and we're definitely going to try to work together some more because they sort of have their information from this direction, and I came from Frank and Lucy down in this direction, and we've just barely touched there. So I think, and it's all a very confusing story. So hopefully between us, we can work that out.
And
I
how
think
do you see DNA playing into future research?
Oh, definitely, because like Jess says, that question of whether John Bixler was the father of all those kids, he sort of assumed that he was there, but this will confirm it. The recorders, if they chose to do that, could see if they match some living descendants of the George McWorter, I think his name was, who was the owner of Free Frank, because that's always been the story that he may have been their father. So you could do things like answer questions like that. I think DNA works very well if you use it with traditional genealogy carefully, because the two can really enhance each other and explain each other. But if you see those commercials on TV where they say, well, I always thought I was Irish and now I'm German or whatever it is. And then we got our DNA done, and now I have to go get a bagpipe. And it isn't like that. You have to interpret it, and you can interpret it a lot better if you've done some traditional DNA or traditional genealogy.
Right.
But the DNA can really enhance it, or it can help answer some questions. And I recently had a big breakthrough with a woman who I have a big brick wall in my family, and that I've always wanted to break down. And there was a woman and her husband and her father who were DNA matches to me. And by looking at who their other matches were, I figured out that's where they were. And we finally figured out that our great grandmothers were sisters. We still don't know who their parents were, but just finding out who a sister was a huge thing for me. I've been looking for that since I was a kid. So, it can work but we had to have our family trees to do that too. They had to be legitimate family trees. So you have to have the two together.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions that they'd like to ask Claire before we close out for the evening?
Thank you.
No? Okay, well, let's give Claire a big round of
thank you.
applause, and we look forward to the Women of New Philadelphia Part 3 in a few years.
Oh no.
We look forward to your book.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you then very
Thank you.
much. We'll have these videos posted on YouTube and on our website in the near future, and we are always looking for great ideas for Lights Lecture 2026. So if you have any, please shoot them our way. And thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Night.